Satala Doshilo. Was I for the day? IMDT Crying Boy Gentle. Run my bounties a day. No day were to sick alone.
The Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600, 10 years old and originally costed a hefty sum. However, they can be picked up used on eBay for around $15 to $20, but I got mine $40 brand new. Something you do have to consider if you're thinking of picking up one of these is that the LGA 775 boards aren't all cheap. And if you plan to overclock like I will later in this video, then you may want to put that into account. I got my board cheap, but most of you may not be so fortunate scrolling around on eBay. From what I read about overclocking, X48 and P45 chipsets are the best, while P41 and P35 have support but are limited. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, as well as add to my list of OC supported chipsets. I'm using a P35 chipset, but I could still overclock easily. Finding DDR2 can be a struggle. A lot of used DDR2 RAM on eBay will say, for AMD only, and I don't know how accurate this is. I recall buying some that didn't work, but I think it was just really bad RAM, because I hear it's all for marketing. Eventually, I found 8 gigs of some Kingston RAM that worked perfectly at 800 megahertz. Now, RAM speed does matter on these old processors, unlike today. I don't want to run with a stock cooler on this chip because it can get very hot, especially since I'm overclocking. I'm going to be using my H105 from Corsair, a bit overkill I know, and it actually doesn't even have proper mounting for LGA 775, so I'm just going to kind of like lay the block on the CPU. A quick recommendation for a cooler is, of course, the Hyper 212 Evo from Cooler Master. It's not a blind recommendation that I'm giving just because everyone else recommends it. I've actually used it and it's not bad for $30.
Saturday. News, deck, and the Lucy. Nulty, gas fan. This model will die. This what I say. Polo, Ravla, Core 2 Quad. Zycone.
Here are the full specs of the system. The Q6600 at 2.4 GHz stock speeds, and I've overclocked it to 3 GHz successfully, as well as a tiny step further to 3.5. I'm using the H105 from Corsair, like I mentioned, so the thermals aren't to fret from. I'm using the Gigabyte GA P35 DS3L, a board that'll be perfect for this CPU. I bought used for $40 from some guy locally using Let Go. I have 8 GB of 800 MHz DDR2 Kingston memory, a 256 gig Crucial MX200 for the boot drive, and a 2 TB Seagate Barracuda that houses our games. A Corsair CX600M to power everything, and finally our graphics card, the GTX 970 from MSI. This is of course to try to eliminate the GPU bottleneck. Now I'm not finished yet. I'll be comparing it to my main system, rocking an unlocked Haswell i5, an MSI Z87 mPower motherboard, 8 gigs of 1600 MHz Patriot memory, and the rest of the specs the same. I'll be using the i5 clocked at 2.4 GHz to match the stock frequency of the Core 2 Quad. This can be attested to the IPC from Kentsfield to Haswell, and I'm also pushing it to the i5 to 4.6 GHz. A bit extreme, but that's a good representation of a modern Intel quad core today. Now I want to address a couple of issues before we begin the benchmarks. With such older hardware, you're going to be getting some outdated features, like PCIe X16, nothing wrong with that, but oh, it's only Gen 1.1. That's rough. It's like running a Gen 2 8x or a Gen 3 at 4x. Could hold back some GPU power, yes. Next, it's running SATA 3. No issue there. Oh, but there it is. 3 gigabit per second, not 6 gigabit per second like we enjoy seeing. And another small thing, no USB 3.0. This was a time before 3.0 existed. Another obvious one, DDR2, no DDR3. Now we're going to be starting off with Cinebench R15. Now these show you the stock speeds of the Q6600 receiving a score of 232 CB, but I'm not disappointed considering its age. Once you overclock, the CB goes way up, and at 3.5 GHz on the Q6600, you get 335 CB, 103 more than the original score. Now these are the temperatures taken with Cinebench. Now even with my super ghetto, just lay the CPU block on the processor because I don't have supported mounting, worked fine. I laid a tape measure on the top for a little bit of extra weight, and it did stay under 60 degrees stock. Max, it got to 66 degrees and overclocked, and those were at the hottest cores. The others stayed around 60 or 50 degrees. I'm pretty sure the reason why the temps between 3 GHz and 3.5 are so close is because the voltage was on auto, and when moving to 3.5, I had to put in my own voltage, being 1.462 volts. Now for quick reference, all games are being run at 1080p, and from bottom to top on the graphs, the items will go Q6600 at stock speeds, Q6600 at 3 GHz, Q6600 at 3.5, and then the i5 at 4.6 GHz. Here in Tomb Raider, the performance appears promising for this old chip, but unfortunately, the other tests won't look like this. Tomb Raider just happens to only scale GPUs. It's possible the couple extra FPS achieved with the i5 is a result of the higher PCIe bandwidth. Now in Bioshock Infinite's benchmark, the minimums like being really low and the averages crazily high. The maximums are so high that they weren't included because they aren't a reasonable metric of performance here. Thief's built-in benchmark is pretty demanding for the CPU, and it struggles achieving only early teens minimum and on average 30 stock and 40 when overclocked. I could consider Shadow of Mordor to be playable even at stock speeds, but moving to 3 and 3.5 GHz is a noticeable boost in performance. GTA 5 is a pretty CPU-intense game, so 16 minimum is expected, and when moving at high speeds, some textures glitch or just have to pop in. Overclocking doesn't just see a nice boost in FPS, but also a decrease in these texture errors. Now Fallout 4 is rough at stock speeds, but when overclocked a little bit, it can become playable. And of course, you can turn settings down. All the settings so far on these games have been pretty high. It should also be noted that VSync is present in this game. The benchmark for Rise of the Tomb Raider gives the stock speeds a 47 average, even though minimums were harsh. Once overclocked, the scores do improve and makes the game much more playable. Our second to last game, Cities Skylines, which was chosen because of how CPU intensive it is, and it really shows here. To get my scores, I used the Los Santos map for GTA 5 and zoomed down into downtown Los Santos and benchmarked 60 seconds with Fraps. Finally, CSGO. In case you're curious how I got these scores, I let Fraps benchmark 3 minutes of Deathmatch on Dust 2. Now with stock, FPS drops below 60, which shouldn't be allowed in a game like this. And thankfully, after overclocking, minimums stay above 60, and average in the high 90s. Again, like Bioshock Infinite, maxes weren't recorded because of how absurd they were. Our final graph shows the averages for every game we tested. The blue bar is the Q6600 at stock 2.4 GHz, and the green is how the equivalently clocked Haswell processor performs. This can be look at the architectures and see how much we progressed, and an IPC comparison on how that's progressed over the generations. Now, using the Q6600 isn't a bad experience. When using an SSD, the whole system still feels pretty quick and responsive. Sometimes things take a second or two to load or open, but this is a 10-year CPU holding up just fine. I think it's aged very well. And when overclocked, it helps everything feel faster and more snappy, like a modern processor. I was in fact surprised by the performance this thing still holds on to. When overclocked, it still plays games just fine, as long as it's paired with a decent graphics card. It could cost you sub 100 for a CPU, motherboard, and RAM similar to these. And on a budget, this could still be a plausible option today. So tell me your thoughts on the Q6600, and I will see you next time.